Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Mac Cormac. I'm a partner here at MoFo, and I had our ESG and sustainability and our impact practices. We This is our 21st episode, and we started this about 3 years ago with BSR, and really the intent of this was to provide some education because as ESG blossomed onto the world stage about 5 years ago, what we learned was a lot of people really weren't sure what it meant and how it was integrated with both business and operations and with compliance, because all of a sudden there was a lot of regulation. But ESG is actually, as a term, has been used since 2004, and in fact the elements of ESG, have been a critical piece of the operations of companies for 25, 30 years. And we partnered with BSR because BSR has been a leader for that entire time. And sort of long before the term ESG was a term, in evaluating how everything from cybersecurity to human rights to climate really is integrated with the business and operations of both private and public companies, as well as investors. And so we started this series, and usually Aron Cramer, who is the CEO of BSR, is my co-host. However, today I'm really pleased that we are going to get to interview Aron and two of his accomplices at BSR. For those of you who don't know Aron, he really is recognized as a global leader on issues related to just and sustainable business. He heads an organization, BSR, that has over 300 members. And Aron is a close advisor to some of the largest corporations on the planet on these issues, whether it's AXA or Nike or SAP or Shell. He is a trusted voice for business on how to navigate these issues in a way that is sustainable, both for the company and for its shareholders. He's on the board of We Mean Business Coalition and also Rise. I will just add that he is the reason I'm in this space. Years ago, he actually started his legal practice at MoFo, and I remember when he had lunch with me and said, "Oh, Suze, as a corporate lawyer, business can have positive impacts as well if you focus there." He is joined this morning or this afternoon for some of you by Christine Diamante. She is the Managing Director of Transformation of BSR and is really also a world leader particularly in working with boards of directors and corporations to help them integrate board governance and leadership on issues related to sustainability. She has 20 years of experience in sustainability, as she was formerly the Chief Sustainability Officer at Alcatel-Lucent, and was head of brand strategy at Nokia and at Alcatel. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have Paloma Muñoz Quick, who is the Director of Human Rights Standards at BSR. She leads BSR's really cutting edge work on human rights around standard setting and knowledge management, and really helping companies to understand and to adapt to the emerging standards and regulations. Before joining BSR, she was an advisor to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and a consultant to the UN Bee Tech Project. She also is a member of and actively involved in advising the US government on responsible business. So you can tell why I'm thrilled that I get to ask questions and we get to hear the knowledge from these folks. And we're going to focus today on really decoding the omnibus legislation and sustainability and governance, really understanding what's happening in Europe and how it relates to companies internationally, but here in the US, particularly when you have headwinds running in the opposite direction in the US. So maybe we could start, Aron, with you, and then Christine and Paloma to talk about kind of why you joined BSR is really my question, and how your work today is focused on or influenced by the omnibus legislation.
Thank you, Suze. Thanks for the kind words. And Suze has been an amazingly influential leader in this space, and I think arguably the first, or one of the first, or the first large firm lawyers to really embrace this agenda, which is a really important development. Um, well, I joined BSR quite a long time ago, and I joined because I was convinced that business had the great opportunity and indeed responsibility to influence the intersection of business and society. We're a world that is awash in acronyms and jargon that the wider public doesn't always understand. But at its essence, this is about practical idealism, in my view, and a way to do what I think the great project of the 21st century ought to be, which is enabling us all to achieve greater levels of prosperity, a fairer world, and stay within planetary boundaries. And business has the amazing, innovative ability to help do that. And again, indeed, the obligation to do that. So that's why I joined BSR. But I think one of the things that is, for me, blindingly true is that the framework conditions that have shaped the lifespan of BSR, going back to 1992, have changed in some fundamental ways. And I think understanding, and one of them is regulatory environment, and understanding that is, I think, crucial for every business.
Christine?
Yes. Well, first of all, a warm good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from around the world, and hello from London. Thank you, Susan and the MoFo team, for having me and BSR in this conversation, as you called it. It's a real pleasure to be here. Why did I join BSR? As you introduced, I spent over 20 years in the corporate sector. I'm a former chief sustainability officer in the tech sector for Alcatel-Lucent. I was head of brand strategy at Nokia. I started off my career in public affairs, head of European affairs at Alcatel. And after having followed the journey for many, many years in the middle of the pandemic, I think many of us felt that it was time to really see what we could do to have the most impact. And I joined BSR. I think it took me 9 months to actually meet a person in person, but it was a wonderful new chapter to work with companies, but from the other side. And instead of having impact on one company, to be able to work with many companies across our membership, B2B and B2C, to have impact in delivering solutions to today's major challenges. I'm passionate and entirely convinced of the role of business in finding the right innovation and solutions to continuously respond to today's volatility. I think businesses today have a keen understanding of risk and how to mitigate risk. But having spent a large part of my career in the tech sector and now working across B2B and B2C, I'm still convinced of the innovation potential of businesses to be able to find new ways of bridging today's major challenges, but most importantly, of driving impact. When it comes to business transformation, Omnibus, which I think was the second part of your question, Omnibus is in all the activities that I lead at BSR. So in business transformation, I work with companies on their strategy, on their governance, including up to the board of directors, on their sustainability requirements and regulations, on their stakeholder engagement, on their foresight, all these elements, and providing advisory on how companies navigate the regulatory framework, but embed strategy and governance and foresight and stakeholder engagement to be able to leverage impact. But second of all, at BSR, we do advisory, insights, and collaboration. And we're doing more than just advising one-on-one. We're also collaborating for systemic change. So at BSR, we have a collaborative initiative called Future Reporting. We have over 100 companies around the world, but mostly across the Atlantic, really exchanging best practices and information regarding regulatory requirements. And this is an important part also of this conversation. And I look forward to sharing some insights and pockets throughout today's session. Paloma.
Thanks for that. Such a great overview. And lovely to be with you all today. Thank you so much for joining and also for the kind invitation. So as mentioned, I lead our human rights standards work. I'm based in Copenhagen. I'm a recent transport. I was based in New York, the New York City office of BSR up until recently. And Why did I join BSR? Well, I've been here now for about 3.5, 4 years. And before that, I was at the UN, where I had the opportunity actually to do sort of a global assessment of how companies, governments, and institutional investors had been sort of taking up the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. In other words, due diligence, standard systems, processes, policies, um, over the last decade since the guiding principles were adopted, and put out sort of a broad stock taking of review report analyzing that, and then developed a roadmap for how companies, governments, and investors should be implementing these standards. What are the opportunities for them to really sort of scale implementation of due diligence and work with stakeholders across different stakeholder audiences, but also across different regions, of companies of different sizes, et cetera. And so after we put out that roadmap for the next decade, really, I really felt that it was time to kind of help companies and work with companies to implement those standards, to really kind of help advance that vision that we put out at the UN, which I should say, prior to the UN, I worked with investors, helping them to engage companies on due diligence. And I also work with civil society and national human rights institutions and government to do the same. So really this opportunity to work with BSR was really aimed at supporting that really robust implementation of due diligence standards. So needless to say, the omnibus, of course, is very relevant for that, since obviously both CSRD, CSDDD, the taxonomy, and the sort of ultimately the EU infrastructure, legal infrastructure around sustainability is grounded on those standards. And so right now, BSR, obviously, everything from supporting companies on how to implement the international standards, how to respond to the regulation. Maybe one example now is that we're kicking off a roundtable of kind of leading companies on the CSDDD, really kind of full steam ahead, regardless of the uncertainty. So that's certainly one effort that maybe I would highlight now. Stop there.
That's great. Thanks so much, Paloma. And well, let's start with the meat of the matter. Aron, maybe you could just provide a little bit of an overview of what the omnibus legislation is and why it is so relevant in the context of sustainability and governance.
You bet. What is the omnibus? The omnibus is an effort to take a look at some of the core building blocks of the European regulatory structure on just and sustainable business. Paloma referenced the two key ones, not the only ones, but key ones, the CSRD for reporting and disclosure, and the CSDDD for due diligence, particularly in value chains. As you may know, the former president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, issued a very influential report last fall, I believe it was, calling for greater competitiveness within Europe. And this has become a real watchword in all the member states of the EU, and having been in the UK last year, also in the UK. And so there is an effort, depending on the omnibus is a little bit like a Rorschach test. Some people will look at it as a way to streamline and make more efficient the European regulatory environment. Some people will look at it and say it's a U-turn away from the commitments that have been so important coming out of the European Union. My personal view is that it's a little bit of both, and that I think there are those who would like to water this down, pure and simple, and competitiveness becomes a very convenient argument for doing so. On the other hand, I think all of the companies that we work with who have been preparing for CSRD, CSDDD, other elements that aren't explicitly in the omnibus, but I think related, Digital Services Act, Deforestation Directive, et cetera, these are expensive to implement, and in some cases suggest that the process is more important than the outcomes. And so I think, as is so often the case, I think the truth lies a little bit in between. And I'm not sure that everyone at BSR, let alone the three from BSR on this call, sees all this the same way, because I think there are valid arguments on both sides of this. So this is what will end up with the current European Commission and the current European Parliament, and then implementation by the member states in the EU. This will become embedded in European Union law, and it is significant because of the size of the EU's market, 500 million citizens, very large market, and Europe has been in the lead in defining the regulatory frameworks for the world on sustainability because there is extraterritorial relevance. You don't have to be headquartered in the EU in order to be subject to the omnibus. So that's why it's of such signal importance practically. I think it is also of significance symbolically, particularly now, at a time when there is geopolitical volatility, economic volatility, a lot of questions around trade. And in the United States, clearly a U-turn in Washington, not so much in places like California and New York, but certainly a U-turn in Washington that the question of is Europe committed to sustainability is on the table, and the omnibus says yes, but or yes, and. And so I think there's a direction of travel question here that is very significant. The other thing that's significant is for large global companies, there is a complete, this is a technical term that I learned in law school, mishmash of regulations and requirements, both on performance and reporting and disclosure and governance. And the EU's regulatory framework is, I'd say, along with the ISSB, probably the most significant effort to streamline, harmonize, requirements, which has the both practical and symbolic benefit of making it easier for companies to know what they're supposed to do, what they're required to do, and what they should do. So I think there's both. So I think that we should not lose sight of that because the complexity, inconsistency, at times illogic of clashing standards and requirements has been a major headache for companies for the whole time BSR has been in existence. And the EU has been arguably the most significant player in trying to bring some order out of the chaos. Whether you like it or not, I think you can say, whether you think it's too onerous, doesn't go far enough, you can say that Europe has played a major role in trying to define what the de facto, if not de jure, global standards are on many important questions.
Yeah, I agree with that. I tend to be in the camp that unfortunately, and because I am I am a lawyer, what I saw, after, with CSRD and ESRS and then the CS triple D is for many companies, this then just moved into purely a compliance exercise. And because the EU went further than sort of the baseline of the ISSB, I worried that in fact so much money would be spent on compliance that in fact companies wouldn't do what BSR helps them do, which is linking this this compliance with operations, with focusing on what will actually, advance the ball in sustainability. And I'm worried, that balance, and I know the omnibus is trying to get better in balance, but we'll see. And from a governance perspective, and I'm not a regulatory lawyer, I'm a governance lawyer, and is really looking at the systems that companies put in place to make sure there's appropriate oversight. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get a drink in a
Sure.
second.
Can I just add a brief point building on
Yeah.
that, Suze? I think so that's right. And I think one of the unintended consequences of a compliance-oriented model, look, compliance is very important, to be sure. And I think on balance, what the European Union has done has been incredibly valuable and important. Risk aversion tends to creep into the equation quite a lot. And so I think that is, and I've seen this firsthand talking with, directors of companies, that they become very risk averse when something is a matter of regulatory compliance. I had an experience with a European headquartered company on whose advisory board I sat, and one of the non-executive directors was also on the advisory board. And she said to me in one meeting, these meetings are much more interesting and much more valuable than our actual board meetings, because at the board meeting, every word has to be recorded. Everything that's said has to be followed up on, and therefore we don't necessarily get to the heart of the matter on some of these questions. And I think that was a pretty telling comment. So anyway, I think unintended consequences often come both from the absence and the presence of requirements, and I think that's true here as well.
And disconnecting, governance again from the end result. I mean, the EU regulation, I think, was intended to put into place a framework that's similar to financial accounting. When somebody does an audit of a company, you need to make sure not only are the numbers right, but is the process to arrive at the numbers right, and are the right people looking at it, and how is that filtered? How is that filtered into the board and board discussion, and how is that managed by the leadership team? I'm not sure they quite the first drafts, and the question will be whether the omnibus, and this is going to be for Christine, whether the omnibus gets us there. I would just say for U.S. companies, and some of my partners ask, like, why should we care? I mean, why are we focused as much on the EU? It is the extraterritoriality, and the omnibus does reduce significantly the number of companies that have to report. But one of the key elements of the existing regulation and the omnibus is that many companies in the US will have to report because they are within the value chain. They are suppliers or customers of the companies in the EU. So the intent of the omnibus, I think, is to make this more manageable and less burdensome. Whether it leads to deregulation or not, we'll see. But I want to focus on the governance point, and turn it over to Christine to talk a little bit about how the omnibus is helping to reframe the oversight function and the function of the board in sustainability.
Thank you very much, Suze. And a few comments here. I think the first one is what changes here is the threshold for those companies under CSRD in the Omnibus package. So the Omnibus simplification package, and I'm looking at my notes over here to make sure I've got it right, for CSRD specifically focuses on large undertakings with over 1,000 employees in either a net turnover exceeding 50 million euro or a balance sheet above 25 million. And so this really does touch large companies. For CSGDD, it also has a different threshold, which I know that my colleague Paloma will refer to. And it also shifts the timing by 2 years under CSRD and Omnibus for those companies in Wave 2 onwards. And there's been some important votes recently. There are more this week as well to really firm up the stop the clock so that we have this pause period in requirements for Wave 2 companies onwards. So that's the first point. What remains untouched, however, in the Omnibus simplification program, whether we're talking about CSRD, whether we're talking about CSGDD, or the other elements, are the board governance requirements. And those still remain an important part of what the EU is trying to do. And if there ever was a business transformation blueprint, the CSRD is it. That is, that it puts governance at the top of the transformation. Companies need to understand, sustainability impact risks and opportunities and make sure that it's embedded in their strategies for long-term value. They have to make sure that they understand it across their operations. They have to map out their value chain. They need to understand who their affected stakeholders are and engage them. All these elements help companies become more resilient in the time of uncertainty. So in terms of the board governance requirements specifically under CSRD that remain untouched, board of directors still have oversight and sign off of sustainability reporting and disclosure with clear responsibilities outlined in the mandates. Sustainability reporting still must be embedded in the broader strategy and risk management and have the necessary controls in place for sustainability data. Boards are expected to play a role in double materiality, at least in understanding and signing off on the process. And they still have a duty to stay informed and build expertise on sustainability matters, as well as overseeing the company's reporting practices. And this also means understanding the simplification of the standards, the ESRS that will be touched by Omnibus. So there's an important role for board governance in overseeing how sustainability is embedded in the strategy, in the company strategy for long-term value, how it's disclosed, the data and the controls in place, the verification, how it is within the company's operations, what it looks like across the value chain, having their finger on the pulse when it comes to stakeholder engagement and understanding their expectations. And I would say that while some board members may see this as an opportunity to take their foot off the pedal, the reality is, within BSR's membership, in fact, board members are moving ahead. They still want to understand how these risks impact their strategy. They still want to get ahead of emerging issues. They really want to understand, what does best practice look like in private companies as well as publicly listed companies? And what does this look like for companies that are located in different parts around the world? So we don't see a softening of board governance. We see a period where boards, in fact, can actually lean into the risks and don't have the duties of scribing everything or having it audited, but are able to have those conversations and those discussions to continuously learn and ensure that they're building resilience at a time of critical volatility. Of course, there will be board members who are going to say, let's pause and let's focus on the business. However, many are actually recognizing this is a core part of business and making sure that they're positioning their companies to build for the long term.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think the companies that, and I would like you and then Paloma to talk about, I mean, many companies are frustrated. I think most of the companies that are most frustrated are because, they've paid $20 million, bluntly, to a large accounting firm to do purely an accounting exercise. This is my bias, when there were many people, myself included, who were 100% confident that CSRD was going to be modified, and they would probably be much better served taking the approach that you did, the governance approach, and looking at the compliance in light of what is really material to the operations and blended into the operations, and how the company, goods and services the company was producing. So, but I know many companies have been very frustrated by this and see this as pausing the clock. What do you say to them? How are you advising them? First you, and then Paloma.
Well, it's very interesting. I think for boards, as I said, the majority of boards that I'm dealing with are not pausing the clock. And what they want to understand is, what are the emerging risks and what's ahead that I'm not ahead of?
Yeah.
And so we are seeing this. But for those board members who are saying, look, stop. I agree that it's important that boards focus on the business. And in many cases, I've had discussions with board of directors where they're just saying, Christine, let's just get this across the line so we can focus on the business of business. And unfortunately, there has been a pivot towards compliance because of the auditing requirements. I think that many auditors have gone above the top. They haven't had the expertise. It's been onerous. It's been costly. It's been draining all the resources away from the real impact that should have happened if we had followed the spirit of the law versus actually going into the details and perhaps taking them too far in terms of the letter of the law. But my response to boards is, do you understand your upcoming risks? Have you looked at the innovation opportunities? Have you engaged with your stakeholders lately? Are you applying foresight and scenarios at a time of volatility? Have you played out your strategy according to different scenarios to really understand how this is going to impact your strategy over the long term? Let's sit down and have this discussion. And I can tell you, in our Future Reporting Collaborative Initiative that I've mentioned, on March 12th, we had a meeting with over 70 companies, and 50% are not pausing when it comes to their CSRD preparations. What they might be pausing are the auditing requirements, but they're not pausing the actual work that delivers impact for companies.
Yeah, and that's exactly, that delivers impact that's tied to longer term profitability and functioning of the entity itself. That's exactly right. And I know that that's what you have been focused on. It's also a part, Paloma, I'd like to turn it over to you to give you a chance to talk about how this integrates with due diligence processes, due diligence in terms of customers and suppliers and, as a company operates. Can you provide some context there?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe one way to start is to also go back to what Aron was saying. It's sort of a Rorschach test, what people mean when they talk about the omnibus, because I think, a lot of different people, when they think about the omnibus, they're thinking about CSRD, they're thinking about reporting, they're thinking about the burdens that places on business and the impacts that has for actually taking action and having an impact. And part of I think the reason for that is, well, two things. One, the kind of very unfortunate sequencing of these laws, with SFDR coming out first, asking investors to report on how their portfolio companies are doing, then CSRD coming out and asking companies to report on what they're doing, and only at the very end coming out with CSDDD, which is actually the law about taking action and having an impact. And so I've seen so many LinkedIn comments come up, oh, CSRD, we've been losing our attention. We've been focusing on reporting the data, the data, the data. You know, the omnibus has been taking attention away from action. But that's not true, because the omnibus is also CSDDD. And so the silos between the different movements, I think, contributes to this feeling. And I think we need to bridge that gap. And I think it gets to then the point that, you know, that what is the CSDDD and how does it relate is a really important point that I'll maybe focus on here a little bit. And just a reminder for everyone, making sure that we're on the same page here. I mean, CSRD is a requirement that actually helps companies know their most significant or severe sustainability impacts, and then show that they're addressing those impacts, show them to investors, but also to people who are impacted, to workers, to communities, to consumers, to end users, right? It's about not just speaking to the traditional sustainability management report crowd. It's not just investors and not just regulators, it's the actual real world people, right? And so this whole approach really is essentially, I think, you know, the CSDDD proposes tackling these most significant impacts in two main ways. One is conducting human rights and environmental due diligence, which really just means, you know, assessing your most significant impacts, addressing them, taking action, using leverage with those business relationships, tracking the effectiveness of those measures, and then disclosing them. By the way, you don't have to report twice. You can disclose through the CSRD management report, which is great. And so this approach, what it does is say, look at your most significant, most severe impacts deep in your value chain, adopt a risk-based approach to doing that, which may mean exclude your tier one relationships altogether. Don't worry about them. That's not where your most severe risks are. And it actually also helps you exclude a large swath of your value chain. And by the way, that due diligence is of your own operations. It's also of your subsidiaries, and under the current law, your full value chain. The other way that the CSDDD asks companies to act on the most significant risks are, of course, by adopting and implementing climate transition plans, which we know is, you know, vitally important for financial material risk, but also opportunities. And I think one thing I just want to say before jumping into perhaps some of the specifics around the omnibus and the changes there is that the current CSDDD due diligence approach is not like a do everything everywhere all at once directive. It's more like a don't look away from the riskiest parts of your business directive, right? It's really about understanding and acting on those impacts that are truly the most severe ones, which again are truly the ones that are most likely to create financial risks and opportunities. And so very much moving away from the traditional approach was just focus on the impacts that are closest to you, the ones that you can see, right? And that really frees up companies to focus their attention on where, again, it matters most for business success and so forth. And it's not a surprise that the CSDDD currently is like that. This is really grounded on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which are essentially the equivalent, if you will, of ISSB, but they're the impact framework, right? ISSB is financial materiality and opportunities. The impact sustainability impact frameworks, the how to do ESG is the OECD guideline, is the UN Guiding Principles. That's how you act on impacts, right? Including disclose. And so as going back to the point, this approach of the omnibus and frankly, the EU altogether, bringing them together is vitally important, but also incredibly challenging, right? And the silos, again, is one of the opportunities. So just a flag, I think some of the issues with the omnibus that are important for companies to realize that there are some significant changes. And the first one is really that the omnibus proposes that companies move away from a risk-based approach to doing their value chain due diligence, right? What it does is say you must proactively assess the impacts of your own operation subsidiaries and your tier one relationships. But wait, if there are potentially significant impacts further down the chain, if there's plausible information to suggest that, you're going to have to reactively assess those and reactively address those, right? So this approach is not that it's saying forget your full value chain. It's just like don't proactively focus there first, which of course suggests that, you know, essentially companies are going to have to dedicate much more of their time and resources on tier one, which tends to be where the less severe impacts are. It also means that companies are going to have to engage all their tier one relationships through questionnaires and so forth. And it also means that even if they're low risk, by the way, and then lastly, there's this approach to reactive due diligence further down the chain. It means that it's really going to supercharge incentives for NGOs, for civil society, for press to kind of name and shame, to populate the data field, right? The plausible data landscape to make sure that companies across industries are aware that this is happening deep in supply chains. So we're really going back to a world where it's not about collaboration with civil society, but it's about reputational risk and harm. So that's what this move away from risk-based due diligence looks like and the implications. There are also some changes to sort of the data, the access that companies can have to data. So issues around, the limitation of companies when it comes to asking for important data related to due diligence of their suppliers, let's say, or their tier one relationships across the value chain, to those that have fewer than 500 employees. They're only going to be able to ask a sort of very limited amount of information on very limited amount of impacts, which is a challenge because there's a caveat which says, unless you absolutely can't find that information elsewhere, right? So go do all the research, try to find out from every other place that you can. But if you can't find it, then you can go back to your suppliers and say, hey, sorry, I need that information. And by the way, under CSRD, you're actually not allowed. There's no exception. We're putting similar limitations on the data that you can ask those same tier one suppliers. But wait, there's no exceptions on that one. So 1,000 employees under CSRD, 500 under CSDDD, that introduces legal complexity, let's say confusion. And it also basically suggests that, there's a lot of inconsistency now, further siloing between these initiatives. Quickly, I'll just say, obviously, there's a limit now to transformative business action. Companies are no longer required to implement climate transition plans. Companies are also not required to monitor the effectiveness of their due diligence every year, but rather every 5 years, making, of course, we know complex supply chains, very hard to understand what's working, what's not. So how does that affect the effectiveness of your actions? Reporting becomes more complex because of changes to the CSRD. The focus there on quantitative data will actually limit the ability of companies doing due diligence to potentially limit their ability to report on their human rights impacts, which tend to be much more qualitative. And it also reduces their ability to report on due diligence processes, systems, processes, and so forth, which are, again, much more narrative-oriented, qualitative in nature. There are a few other challenges there, but I'll stop there. Maybe I'll just flag that the last thing is, of course, now companies don't have to be subject to civil liability, which I think is widely seen as something good. The problem, of course, is that it throws it back to member states. So now we're just going to have, it's not that victims or there isn't going to be any ability for victims to actually get remedy. Just means that now every state in the EU can come up with their own liability regime.
Yeah,
exactly. Which gets us back to a lot of the headaches that companies have had already. So again, when we talk about the simplification, the ease of the Omnibus, I think it's quite different when it comes to the CSDDD, perhaps, than when it comes to the CSRD. And it's important to recognize that.
No, I agree. And I like your comments on the silos, and I'm hoping they break down. I mean, one of the things I've often noticed is the silos you have with advisors and law firms and everything else. It's the same when you're going to your first tier suppliers. You really need to be coordinated because you're asking them questions about human rights and climate. And for those people who are afraid of it early on, I'm like, you already have that muscle with anti-corruption, anti-bribery. You already understand the need to get the data. What you can't have is one arm of your organization asking, your supplier one series of questions on human rights and a totally different, related to your cybersecurity. So it's got to be a coordinated effort. What are some of the others? Aron, I want to go to you and then Christine. And also, there are no questions, but we're We're about 40 minutes in. I want to make sure our audience is staying with us. If you guys have questions for these are the experts here, please put them in and I will ask them. What are some actionable steps companies can take? Particularly, I mean, a lot of what we've been saying for the last, 40 minutes is you got to stay the course. You got to look more long term, and you have to be able to tie this to your business and operations as opposed to just looking at this as a compliance exercise. But Aron and Christine, what are some actionable steps companies can take right now?
Let me start with a couple of things and say, in no aspect of business does a company comply its way to innovation, to product development, to market entry, and to, frankly, to social trust. And so I think we have to keep in mind that the compliance regime that's being created is very important. It should be viewed as a floor, not a ceiling. So let me give one practical example of that. Paloma just spoke to the fact that companies are no longer required to implement their climate transition plan, although they are obligated to create one. Now, I don't know on what planet a company would develop a climate transition plan simply for the purpose of complying with the requirement and then leave it on the shelf. Honestly, that is abdicating responsibility. That is governance malpractice, in my view. And so, thinking about the various elements here and using them for strategic value at a high level, that's something that is important. And at the risk of stealing something Christine might want to say, I would say that scenarios are very important. Now, I say this partly because we do scenarios for companies related to various aspects of sustainability. Keep doing them and keep doing them with honesty and integrity. Our experience has been that many companies in implementing requirements from the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, did scenarios about physical and transition risks from climate, but the foundational assumptions underneath those scenarios were probably unrealistically sunny. And so I think doing that scenario thinking, bringing it to board level, and doing it in, I don't want to imply dishonesty, but do it in a way that is fully honest and embracing of the realities that we are likely to see. And I say realities plural very deliberately because the point of scenarios is to look at various different outcomes, not make a prediction about a single outcome. The world just doesn't work that way. Scenarios are not intended to work that way. So those are a couple of things. One that is that are at a minimum implied in the omnibus, in some ways required, but it's not whether I'm doing it or not, which is what a compliance mindset brings you to. It's how I'm doing it and for what purpose. And that is the question to keep in mind, in my view.
If I could just, Aron, you didn't steal my thunder, but I will reinforce the scenario a bit because I think it's extremely important. But it's funny, I have a small story to tell, Suze. Less than 24 hours after Omnibus was published, and completely by chance, we had a long-standing breakfast dialogue with our members planned on the 27th of February in London. So the Omnibus came out at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 26th, and at 8:30 in the morning, the 27th, we had, 25 companies with us talking about Omnibus. And what was really interesting was over a half of the room said their biggest disappointment was now that they finally got the whole company's attention, they got the board's attention, they got this embedded across the business, they have mapped out their value chain, they had started engaging, all of a sudden the European Commission was throwing their credibility in the air. So don't lose the important momentum of the things that you have built up to now. And so if I were to say, what are the 5 steps that I would recommend to companies? The first one is continue to understand your impacts, risks, and opportunities and how they are material to your business. So double materiality is an important exercise to do. And you have the bonus that for now anyways, you don't have to go under limited or reasonable assurance. The second thing is continue to invest in climate transition plans and and credible implementation. As a former head of brand, you can't just have wallpaper on your website. It's about experience, it's about loyalty, it's about trust, it's about action. And we've got big challenges in the world when it comes to climate transition. So implement those action plans. The third thing is map your value chain, assess and understand your risks. And Paloma has talked about this. It's about the real action and engage with your stakeholders proactively, not reactively. We're doing a lot of work with companies in understanding what is their stakeholder policy, what is their approach to global stakeholder engagement, and how does that map locally, and how do they engage locally with affected stakeholders. And so part of this is your risks and your due diligence, and part of it is just actually running a responsible business that is attuned to the communities where you do business. Use foresight to navigate uncertainty. A lot of the work that I'm doing is working not only with boards, but with also leaders, with management teams, and with sustainability governance to figure out how do they do this now that it's cross-functionally embedded across the organization, and what does this look like across different potential scenarios so that you can build greater agility in your strategy. And also helps you with your goals. And this leads to the fifth point that I want to talk about is collaborate. We started off where I was saying that BSR does advisory, insights, and collaboration. We have different collaborative initiatives. You don't need to have goals and strategies for everything, but perhaps you also need to reach out into your ecosystem and collaborate more thoroughly together to be able to tackle these risks and also understand what is the opportunity in the innovation as individual companies and as an ecosystem. And this will help you with the final goal, which is continuous learning and upskilling. These issues are not going away. If not, they will continue to be major risks. So build your expertise for yourself, for your teams, internally, top down, bottom up, and engage with your stakeholders. And this is how you're going to build momentum on really delivering sustainability as part of your long-term business value.
No, I completely agree. And, when people ask me, like, is ESG dead? I mean, I borrow from Judy Samuelson, ESG is dead, long live ESG. Like the elements, and BSR was focused in this area, and we were long before the term ESG came, and I don't know a single company that is not focused on, elements of ESG like cybersecurity and privacy, which are just critical to business and operations. And and climate and risk associated with the business. And so there is that fundamental, in addition to kind of the regulatory requirements, which are shifting. In the US, that's what I advise. I'm like, all of these are material and critical to your business. And you can just change the terminology. I really don't like, and Aron and I may disagree, I don't like the term green hushing. I haven't liked it the whole time because some of our most active clients in this area are quietly doing it very, very well. They just may not be broadcasting it. And in the US right now, depending on what you call it, you may hit political hot buttons that you don't need to. And so you can either make a decision, we're going to be out and we're going to be open and we're going to fight the good fight, or we're just going to continue to do what we're doing, but we don't need to, to be overly provocative. But that's just my aside on terminology.
Well, Suze,
Jane,
you
go
will
ahead.
notice that I didn't say ESG a single time.
Oh, I know. I
You have
did.
said
That's
it.
why. That's
So
exactly why I
whether
wanted
we're
to make
talking
the.
about floods, whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking about climate, whether we're talking about human rights, which Paloma, whether we're talking about modern slavery, whether we're talking about supply chains, living wage, all these issues. They can be risks, they can be opportunities, they can be innovation factors, but companies need to understand them and how they affect their operations and how they affect their strategy. But I'll
Yeah,
pass the
that's
microphone back to
exactly
my
right. And
colleague,
yeah,
Paloma.
the terminology hasn't really been working for a while. Aron and I talk about it, and so now we need to make sure we are correctly and accurately describing what we're doing. And some of that there is the element of compliance in terms of, the European and other jurisdictions. So I just want to ask a couple more questions here at the end. What's working and what's not? Paloma, you want to take that just quickly, and then we'll also talk about sort of maybe the distinction between business and civil society, and then I'm going to ask you guys to give us some predictions about what next. Go ahead, Paloma.
Great. Yeah. So what's working, what's not? I mean, maybe just I'll quote what companies are starting to say, certainly when it comes to due diligence. One very interesting statement that was recently published was by German SMEs. As maybe some people here know, the German Supply Chain Act is very, very similar to the CS triple D, the omnibus version of CS triple D, right? The focus is on tier one and so on and so forth. And so German SMEs have actually called on the German government to actually ensure a quick revision of the Supply Chain Act to ensure that it's aligned with the CS-triple-D, since it ensures that companies focus on the most severe human rights and environmental risks in their supply chain instead of, end quote, instead of collecting information and contractual assurances from their suppliers in a non-specific and large-scale manner, alongside several and other measures that are in the CS triple D meant to support SMEs, right? And so they really are insisting that the problem with CS triple D is not for SMEs at least so far, has not been the actual law itself, but the fear that companies are going to misinterpret it and misapply it in ways that we've seen, for example, in Germany. And so the German government actually came out recently and said, no, the approach is actually meant to be one of supporting SMEs and so forth. So I think it's important to recognize that that's what a big piece. More recently, company business associations have actually come out, including Amfori and others. Together, these associations represent about 6,000 companies. They released a statement on the omnibus, and they said that, and quote, simplifying due diligence and reporting requirements can be achieved without moving away from the spirit of international standards, right? The international standards, the due diligence standards, OECD guidelines, the UN guiding principles. And they call on legislators to engage with companies who've actually been doing this for a long time to really find out how do we tweak this to ensure that these different rules are actually effective at achieving the standards, but also feasible, practical for companies. And then last but not least, maybe I'll just say, I think one of the challenges has been, because there are these different elements of the omnibus, companies right now are, we can't say much on it, because if we feel this about that, this about this, and what we're stepping back, so I just think that the main message here is align with international standards. That's always going to be a safer bet. Governments are adopting these laws, other laws, the EU Forced Labor Act, a range of other EU legislation right now currently requires companies to sort of de facto conduct due diligence. And the EU deforestation is one of them. It's not a specific due diligence requirement in the same way, but it de facto involves that. It's supposed to be complementary. Many countries are adopting national level laws, Norway, Switzerland, and even Thailand came out recently saying they're going to announce, among others. So those are just my initial reflections based on what's working, what's not.
And I'm a little biased because I was involved in the early days of SASB, as Aron knows. But I do think the ISSP is a good baseline. Like when people are like, "Where is regulatory?" That there were like 120 jurisdictions who said, "Yeah, we're going to generally follow this framework." And there are elements of the regulatory framework that everybody's following. I mean, TCFD, climate risk scenario analysis, like every oil company. I mean, it's like there's so much of this that is already factored in. As I said, a lot of it is terminology, but I'd love to turn it back as we wrap up to Christine and Aron to just maybe what is top of mind, what is pressing in the US. Everybody talks generally about the anti-ESG, but it's really all about DEI and climate. But what is top of mind for companies in this area, number one? And then maybe all of you, kind of what next? You provided some of it earlier, but your practical advice for what to do as we wait. And as Aron said at the beginning, we're not at the end. The omnibus has to be rolled out. We do have, unfortunately, some regulatory uncertainty. And Paloma, as you correctly pointed out, a lot of this is delegated to the individual countries, and there is going to be some disparity, which makes compliance even a little bit more difficult. But maybe kind of what is first of mind, maybe Christine or Aron, and then all of you a minute or two on what's next.
So I take a quick stab.
Go for it, Christine.
Yeah. Okay. From an EU perspective, and Aron, I'll let you I'll leave you to tackle the United States. First of all, as I mentioned in our latest Future Reporting Collaborative Initiative, when we polled our members on March 12th, 50% are still plowing ahead with Wave 2 CSRD reporting. Some 6% are pausing. Some 40% are just having a look around, but most of them are looking at the IFRS. So I think, Suze, as you said, you've got 2/3 of the globe that is really following the IFRS and the ISSB at that international level, both the global north and the global south. So make sure you understand those international frameworks, as Paloma said, whether it's the IFRS, it's the OECD, it's United Nations global guidelines. Second thing is that while everybody's focused on disclosure and due diligence, there's a whole wave of product sustainability requirements that are growing in Europe. So you've got eco design, you've got packaging and packaging waste, and you've got the EU Deforestation Directive. So keep your eyes on the growing product regulation. And I would just say that for European companies in Wave 1, this is about resilience and building competitive companies and competitive economy. And so they will continue capitalizing on the important efforts that have been made and making sure they're driving impact. I don't think we're seeing people who are radically stopping. Those who are stopping are taking advantage of it to look ahead and making sure they understand what are the next emerging issues.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Regulatory is both disclosure and corporate action. And that corporate action is operational, UK human rights, and it is products and it is services. And that's both, that is worldwide. So Aron, maybe we'll let you have the final word here.
Right. So thank you for a really rich discussion. I will indeed speak a little bit to the situation in the United States and the interplay here. And you may have seen there's a piece of legislation proposed by Senator Haggerty in the Senate that would prohibit companies in certain quote unquote strategic sectors from complying with European regulatory requirements. I doubt that will, pass because of the filibuster. But the broader point is for companies headquartered in the US and doing business in the United States, it is a risk certainly to ignore some of the developments that can create problems. But I'd say there are also risks by overdoing a shift because of what's happening today, March 31st, 2025. I think it is an open question about what will continue to be the case in the United States over a period of time. I wrote something a year ago, and this might sound self-congratulatory, but more it's a little bit haunting. And the theme was the United States is busy marginalizing itself in the global sustainability in the context of sustainability globally. And I think we're seeing that right now. So you cannot ignore what the United States government is doing. I would never suggest that to anybody. But equally, I think what's happening in the United States is out of step with what we are seeing all around the world. I think we've made it 58 minutes without hearing mention of China, but it's very, very significant. And other important places such as Singapore and Thailand was mentioned. So global companies need to take a global approach that can't out and out violate American law, but I think neither can it prioritize only American law and expectations as they are today. And I think volatility is getting a good workout these days in terms of describing the situation. I think that is where we are right now. So, don't ignore things you can't ignore, but don't overreact to things either that may not be a lasting part of the landscape and may be out of step with how the world is moving.
Well, I think that's a really good way to end it. I completely agree. I would just say I think the U.S. is out of step on a lot of things, in addition to sustainability. But the elements of sustainability, and when you understand its roots and how it relates to the business and operations, and that is why I was personally very frustrated when many, many multinationals were paying a lot of money to accountants who didn't know what they were talking about, and not really understanding the synergies, which you all have helped us illuminate the synergies between, from their governance, from the board, in terms of the management and how it operates, in terms of the diligence and supply chain, and their business and operations and their strategies for opportunities and innovation. I think you have pulled all of those together. I thank you very much. Our 21st episode. Hope that our audience has enjoyed this, and please stay tuned. End of April, we are going to have one of the CEOs of one of the most innovative companies in this space come and chat with us. So, Aron, Christine, Paloma, thank you very, very much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.